Welcome to the fourth episode in a Legendarium series about Rome's Bloodiest family. In part 4, Clawing Back to Power, we will talk about how the Severan family briefly lost power to a usurper named Macrinus. However, the Severans soon clawed their way back to power and took revenge upon those who dared to challenge them. However, the family and Rome were brought to a new crisis by the outlandish behavior of the new Severan Emperor Elagabalus, as well as Elagabalus's attempt to impose a new religion upon the Roman Empire. In April 217 AD, Caracalla, the last surviving son of Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, came down with a slight case of sword in the stomach. The man who killed him, Martialis, died at the hands of the emperor's guards. Caracalla's Praetorian commander, who probably helped to engineer the murder, proclaimed himself emperor. Very little is known about Macrinus, the man who briefly removed the Severan dynasty from power. He was born in northwest Africa around 164 AD to middle-class parents. He entered imperial service and eventually became Praetorian commander under Caracalla. How did Macrinus achieve so much? Partly by sheer ruthlessness. Harsh even by Roman standards, Macrinus crucified soldiers for insubordination, a punishment usually reserved for slaves. When faced with mutiny, Macrinus decimated his men, choosing 1 out of 10 men to be beaten to death by their own comrades. For mere complaining, Macrinus ordered centimation, the killing of 1 in 100, a punishment that he considered far too lenient. Indeed, Macrinus was so sadistic that his own house slaves called him Massalinus, the butcher. Though Caracalla had been hated by the Senate and the city of Rome, the legions revered him. After all, Caracalla had won a series of victories in Parthia and Germania, marched alongside his troops, and even challenged enemy commanders to single combat and defeated them. So when Macrinus seized power, the army openly wondered if Macrinus had murdered Caracalla. Macrinus's actions also outraged Caracalla's mother, Julia Domna, who hoped to keep some power in the new regime. Sensing that Julia might be a threat to him, Macrinus ordered her to leave Antioch. Suffering from an advanced stage of breast cancer and mourning the deaths of her 2 sons, Julia refused to leave Antioch. Instead, she committed suicide by starving herself to death. That might have been the end of the Severan dynasty, but Julia's sister Julia Maesa and her 2 nieces Julia Somias and Julia Mamea left Antioch and vowed to restore their family. Both of them had sons who could claim the throne when the time was right. The Severans soon had a chance because of Macrinus's failures. Before his murder, Caracalla had won a series of victories against Rome's eastern rival, the Parthians. Macrinus would not be as fortunate. In one of his first acts, Macrinus battled the Parthians to a stalemate at the Battle of Nisibis. Perhaps mindful of how hated he was by the military and facing stronger resistance from the Parthians, Macrinus made peace. However, Macrinus made it on appalling terms, giving the Parthians 200 million sesterces. As if this humiliation wasn't enough, Macrinus paid for the Parthian bribe by cutting the raises that Caracalla had given the legions before his death. On top of that, Macrinus began to show his legendary cruelty in Roman law, pushing for new edicts that called for adulterous couples to be tied to a stake and burned alive together. Mere fornicators would be sewn into the inside of a dead ox until they themselves perished. Small wonder that Julia Maesa did not have to wait long to restore her family to power. Julia Maesa, the sister of Julia Domna, presented her grandnephew Elagabalus to the legion near the family's ancestral home of Emesa. She concocted the scheme with her niece Julia Somias and her lover Gannes. The 14-year-old Elagabalus, son of Julius Somias, bore a striking resemblance to Caracalla, which led many to believe that he was in fact Caracalla's illegitimate son. Today, it is known for certain that Elagabalus was only Caracalla's nephew, but the soldiers happily proclaimed the 14-year-old emperor. Desperate to keep the throne and his head, Macrinus named his 9-year-old son Diadum as co-emperor and heir. He hoped that this move, coupled with a last-minute restoration of pay raises, would turn the tide in his favor. It did not. On June 8, 218, Macrinus' loyalists were defeated by Severan rebels outside Antioch. Macrinus fled north, shaving his beard in hopes of escaping detection. However, one of Macrinus' own men betrayed him and handed him over for execution. Earlier, Macrinus tried to send his son Diadum to the Parthian court for safety, but he too was captured and murdered by Severan rebels. Though a relation of Emperor Septimius Severus and Caracalla, Elagabalus had grown up in Emesa, where his family served as hereditary high priest of the god Elagabal, likely a derivative of the Phoenician god Baal. After becoming emperor, Elagabalus spent several months touring the east. During that time, he ordered the execution of his mother's lover, Gannys. Most likely, his mother, Julius Samius, feared that Gannys had outlived his usefulness and now sought too much power, so she ordered her son to execute him. Real power now lay with Elagabalus' mother, Julius Samius, and his great-aunt, Julia Maceia. When the Severan family returned to Rome in 219, they brought with them a black meteorite stone that served as cult symbol of the god Elagabal. Elagabalus had the black stone installed on the Palatine Hill and then built a great new temple called the Elagabalium to hold it. Every day at dawn, Elagabalus personally sacrificed vast numbers of sheep and cattle at the altars so that many of the corpses piled up on the steps. Military prefects and important officials were conscripted to serve as priests, wearing long Phoenician-style robes and carrying sacrificial entrails and spices in golden bowls. Stories began to spread of bizarre religious practices, in which the young emperor chanted songs to Elagabal while sacrificing humans by feeding them to lions and monkeys. Whether these stories were true or not, Elagabalus intended to remake Roman religion, getting rid of Jupiter and installing Elagabal in his place. In elaborate midsummer ceremonies, the black stone was taken from the temple on a grand procession around Rome, drawn in a chariot pulled by 6 white horses, with the emperor running backwards in front of the chariot so as not to turn his back to the sun god. Along with his religious mania, the young emperor married and divorced at least 3 wives in 3 years after quickly tiring of the women. He also freely had relations with women outside of marriage, though his relations with men truly shocked Roman society. Supposedly, Elagabalus secretly wished to become a woman, trying to find a surgeon who could change his gender. This behavior climaxed with a marriage to a Carian slave named Hierocles, who was allowed to beat the emperor as if he really was his wife. According to writers of the time, Elagabalus took to wearing tunics made of gold cloth studded with jewels and wearing diamonds sewn into his shoes. Elagabalus also threw dinner parties in which he forced his guests to eat live parrots and wax replicas of actual food while feasting among human entrails scattered on the floor. The regime only survived as long as it did because Elagabalus' female relations really ran the empire while he misbehaved. However, the emperor's antics soon became too much for the legions, who began to openly shop around for another emperor. In a desperate attempt to regain support, Elagabalus' mother Julia Samius convinced Elagabalus to adopt his cousin Alexander Severus as heir. For a time, this ended the crisis, and Severan power was safe. However, this started another crisis, as Julia Samius soon had a falling out with her sister Julia Mamea, who grew impatient to see her own son, Alexander Severus, wearing the purple. Perhaps fearful that dear Aunt Julia Mamaea might try to replace him with cousin Alexander, Elagabalus ordered Alexander murdered in March 222. Instead, the Praetorians, who should have carried out the murder, openly demonstrated in favor of Alexander Severus. When Elagabalus tried to have the demonstrators executed, the Praetorians rebelled. A terrified Elagabalus sought safety in a latrine. The Praetorians kicked down the door, stabbed him as he sat on the toilet, and then hunted down his mother Julius Sammaeus. They took their bodies into the streets, disrobed them, and then dragged them behind donkey carts before throwing their bruised, battered corpses into the Tiber River. Not long after, the Praetorians proclaimed Alexander Severus emperor with his mother Julia Mamaea at his side. Will Alexander fare any better than his cousin Elagabalus? We'll find out in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Legendarium. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.